Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am delighted to be joined today by Rebecca Tolin, who has recovered from ME/CFS after a monster 13 years. And we're going to dive into that and her sort of transformation, I think, as you describe it. And also maybe dive into a little bit about your work as a coach, as well as a research consultant as well, which you've added to your CV. So a very warm welcome to the podcast. I'm delighted to have you here.
Oh, it's so good to be here, Jackie.
I'm really excited to kind of dive into all of this. Maybe before we start, can you just say a little bit about yourself and maybe what life was like in the before times, like before you got sick?
Yes, it was quite a monster of a recovery journey, as you mentioned in the beginning. But before I got sick with ME/CFS, I was a very healthy, active broadcast journalist. So I worked as a TV news reporter covering nature and science. I traveled the world quite a bit. I was athletic. I hiked and jogged and lifted weights and swam and was very social. And then I went through a really traumatic experience. And after that experience, I became really ill for many years. And that recovery journey with ME/CFS and a number of other chronic symptoms really took me places I never would have imagined personally and professionally in the work I do. And I'm at the point now, it's been about 6 years or so since I felt I recovered from really debilitating ME/CFS, migraines, insomnia, interstitial cystitis, and some other symptoms. I can finally say I actually really just feel grateful for all that I've gained from the experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I'm going to totally derail us very briefly here, because the whole gratitude thing really interests me. Because listeners will have heard this story before, where I interviewed somebody who'd recovered, and I was, as it turned out, about halfway through my journey, although I didn't realize that at the time. And she said something along the lines of being grateful for her experience. And oh my goodness, did I want to hit her?
Yes.
I was in the middle of this horrendous experience that I didn't know if I was going to come out of. I felt completely hopeless. I hadn't found anything that helped. And this person was grateful for that. I just felt so angry for that. And what I found really interesting is how my perspective on that has changed. And I don't feel grateful for the experience as such, but I do feel grateful for what it's taught me and where I now am. And, I think everyone has their own little kind of individual spin on this. But a lot of people do say that gratitude for some part of it. So I find it really interesting that that was something you brought up very early there.
Yes, and I can so relate to what you're saying. There were several people that suggested this was a great opportunity to grow and learn earlier on, and I definitely wanted to slug them. And I was not ready to receive that message. And I also really relate to what you're saying. It's not that I'm grateful for all the suffering per se, but I am grateful for what that cultivated in me. And for some of us, suffering is a portal into more authentic connection with ourself. And that's been true for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's quite a nice way of putting it, actually. Yeah. Okay, back on track. Um, I love a good tangent. Um, so, you said that you had this traumatic experience and then shortly after that became unwell with all of these, what we might call mystery symptoms or mystery illness or unexplained symptoms or all these kind of quite big, scary words for something that actually feels pretty big and scary in your body as well at the time, doesn't it? Can you talk a little bit through, I don't know, maybe some of that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I experienced a sexual assault and it was very traumatic, so much that I really just kind of shut down and blacked it out and didn't tell anyone and didn't get therapy for a long time. But shortly after that, I became very ill with a series of viruses. And after those viruses, my system really crashed. So it's kind of familiar to a lot of people with long COVID or ME/CFS that these really extreme symptoms can start after a viral episode. And I went from, as I said, being this kind of world traveling, really active young person in my 30s to not being able to leave my house. The symptoms were just like extreme flu-like symptoms, insomnia, everything ached and burned. I had lightheadedness, dizziness, lots of brain fog. I felt like I couldn't even remember the name of a close friend or colleague. And the tired and wired was really challenging because I couldn't sleep, and I had normally been a very deep sleeper. So I went to many doctors and practitioners over a 13-year period. And in the beginning, of course, I was quite frantic to figure out what was going on. And there just wasn't any clear explanations. I did start getting the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome or ME/CFS, post-viral syndrome. And for many years, I really chased a lot of the labs that doctors pointed out, which was Epstein-Barr virus was a big one. I really targeted that with antiviral, IV medications, which really just crashed my system more. I was taking lots of different supplements and herbs for things they were finding, like heavy metal or mold exposure. Chronic Lyme was another thing I was diagnosed with, doing all the really restrictive diets for candida and leaky gut. I think for 3 years, I just ate either fish or chicken and green vegetables. That's how strict I was. And I was more bloated than ever and just also had lots of digestive issues. So none of those interventions were working. And they really felt like doctors were just kind of throwing supplements or medications at me and weren't clear on what was happening. Over the years, I did start getting some psychotherapy, and I think that was helpful, but I again wasn't really linking that to my symptoms. And it went on like that until I just, first of all, kind of ran out of money and I couldn't work. I was on federal disability. I lost a career that I loved and really my ability to function much in the world. Um, which was a very lonely place to be. And I just started noticing, though, over the years, of course, none of these things are helping. And there really weren't podcasts like this back then. There weren't YouTube channels. There weren't people sharing their recovery stories, at least that I knew of. So I was in the biomedical model. But I realized that that just wasn't helping. And the only thing that gave me a little bit of relief was gentle yoga, meditation, just being out in nature. I liked listening or reading a little bit of Eckhart Tolle. I couldn't actually read much because of the brain fog, but I really kind of integrated that message of being in the present moment. And that's really all I had because I couldn't plan much in the future given how I felt. And those practices really just started giving me a little bit of emotional and mental relief. And so I just sunk into those and I got off this biomedical roller coaster. And interestingly, that's when I took an online poetry class and I met a woman who recovered from ME/CFS. And she told me about her experience. And I got it. I actually had a real breakthrough just from listening to her recovery that this was possible for me too.
Yeah, and I think, you've made such an important point there, about hearing that someone, even if it's just one person, has recovered from something like what you had. And, I remember having a similar experience. You're very, very lonely. You're very alone. There might be other people out there suffering very similar things to you, but because you can't get out there and you can't engage in life and you're completely cut off from everything, you've no idea about that. I mean, I found that even with long COVID, where actually many, many, many people were experiencing the same thing at the same time. I didn't know that because I was so deep in my horror show of my own experience that I hadn't joined any of those dots. And maybe that did happen a little quicker because of the situation there. But this hearing somebody else, that validation of what you're going through, I think is so important. But also knowing that it is possible. It may seem completely impossible to you in that moment. How can I ever recover from this? But knowing that somebody has, I think there is so much power in that, isn't there?
I'm so glad you spoke to that power of the story because I don't know if I ever thought of it quite that way. That here I had
Mm.
seen 50 different practitioners, many of whom were doctors. Um, and then it was one woman who actually wasn't any kind of a therapist or a physician who just told me her story. And it was a long conversation, it was 3 hours. But I'll always remember it because she told me all her symptoms and they were my symptoms. And she also listened to me.
Mhm.
And she explained some of the science too, even though she was a layperson. I had been a science journalist and I love that. And so she shared the work of Dr. John Sarno and Howard Schubiner, who described that a lot of really severe and real physical symptoms can be caused by the brain and nervous system when they're in a state of heightened stress and that there doesn't have to be a physical or pathological reason. And it just, a light bulb went off, both with that knowledge and with the empathy and the understanding and the recovery that she modeled for me. And I actually got up and ran around the block after that conversation, which I had not ran in 13 years. I mean, I remember at the end of this conversation, Jackie, she said, Rebecca, you're not broken. You're not irrevocably sick. Yes, you feel sick, but these symptoms are a result of the state of your brain and nervous system, and you can shift that. And I just realized I'm not sick. I stopped seeing myself like having a disease process that I couldn't actually impact. And that shift made a huge difference for me, so much that I filled with energy. Now, that was not the end of the story. I will say I did not have one of those book cures or recovery story cures where all the symptoms just went away after that. But it was enough of a moment where I had a new understanding about what was happening in my body. And I had that new possibility from someone else's recovery that I felt it in the body. And therefore, I knew I was on the right track.
Mm. And I think, yeah, the word possibility there, there is, we don't see that possibility, I think, often when we are so in the experience. But if we find a way to see any little possibility, even if it's just like, okay, today maybe I don't spend my whole day in bed, that there might be a possibility of that. It doesn't have to be running a marathon tomorrow kind of thing. I think that again can have that amazing, um, I don't know, some sort of shift or power, even if it's not now, maybe it's at some point kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, possibility and hope are so important.
Mm,
And I think that you also are pointing to something else that was really impactful for me was I had been told by a number of doctors that I had adrenal exhaustion and I needed to carefully pace or I would actually hurt myself. So my world became very small in terms of restricting activity. But what this lovely woman named Kathy explained to me, and which I later learned through the books of Dr. Schubner and Dr. Sarno, was actually I was training my brain into this state of fear and hypervigilance with the restriction, and I did have to start moving out of my little bubble. And start expanding my window of activities very slowly, but as a way to retrain my brain and body for what was possible. And that these living again was actually safe for me. But I had to know and understand that I wasn't kind of damaging myself to do that. And I think that there's a lot out there now around neuroplasticity and understanding
Mm.
how the brain works, and that our subconscious mind is very much responding to our environment and giving us signals through our body in the form of symptoms. And we can play a role in shaping that experience.
Mm. Yeah, now you said something a moment ago. Actually, you said something about I'm not broken. And again, I love this. You're not broken. That doesn't mean you're not sick, because you clearly are, but you're not broken. You're dysfunctional. And I thought that I love that. I need, post-it note that one. But you mentioned that these symptoms being a byproduct of, dysfunction in the brain and the nervous system, and not some sort of pathological process. But for some people, whether it's relevant or not, there are all sorts of tests and things that are showing things like viral persistence, or, you were talking about Epstein-Barr and some of the other things. So how does this all link together for the sort of people who do have tests that say these things, and people who maybe don't have those tests because they haven't had the tests, but maybe do have some of that pathology underlying?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this up. And of course, I'm now a mind body coach, and I work with a lot of people with long COVID and ME/CFS, but I want to be clear, I'm not a medical doctor. So of course this isn't advice in that way. And I honestly don't think I would have believed this unless I went through 13 years of chasing all the viral particles, the underlying viruses, the damaged mitochondria, the Lyme bacteria, and having that not work. I very much believed those things were causing my symptoms because I was told that by doctors, or at least they said, well, these treatments might help. But none of them did, and they typically made me worse. And so, what I came to learn and experience and believe through my studies and also my own journey was that these underlying pathologies were not the root cause of the symptoms. Now, it is true when our brain and nervous system is in flight, fight, or freeze, it's not working optimally. And so our energy is going towards creating stress hormones, for instance, instead of digesting our food. So we may have poor digestion, poor immunity, and the mitochondria aren't working as well. But what I found was that actually learning ways to create a sense of somatic safety in my brain and nervous system then impacted all the other systems and cells in my body in a downstream way to come back into balance.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. So it's using the nervous system to influence everything else. I'm picturing it as like one of those weeping willows, where the kind of leaves float down over everything else. I'm a very visual person. Um, that's how
I
that
love
happened for me.
weeping willows.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean that does make sense to me. I think where people tend to get quite, I'm going to say upset or, push back against this idea of mind-body medicine or nervous system or whatever you want to call it, is this idea of it being quote unquote all in your head, um, and possibly, I'm spitballing here, but the idea that because you have power over it, it means that you're making a choice to be sick. And I think that's where a lot of people can get quite, upset about, that they're choosing to be ill rather than not choosing to be ill. And I would be
Exactly.
really interested to hear your kind of take on that, because it's not
Yeah,
an easy journey either way.
exactly. But again, I really appreciate you bringing this up because I understand that there will be people listening who could perceive that that's what we're saying, that it's in your
Mm,
head and that you have some conscious control. And I just want to say from my own experience with 13 years of MECFS and now also studying and training in this field and working with many people, this is a completely subconscious process. This is how our subconscious brain and our autonomic nervous system work. And we actually do not have any conscious control over it. That would be like if I would say, oh, I want my heart to beat faster now, or I want it to beat slower now. I have no control over that. I can't actually just speak to my subconscious brain, which really is 90-95% of our brain and nervous system are unconscious. So we absolutely don't have control over it. And it is not our fault for having these symptoms. And I think we're really on the cusp of a shift in understanding from this biomedical model, which works really well if you have a broken arm or a cancerous tumor, there is actually physical and structural damage in the body that needs to directly be treated. But that biomedical model doesn't work really well with a lot of these so-called medically unexplained symptoms like long COVID and ME/CFS, and even things like migraines and irritable bowel syndrome. And so the doctors that I've since trained with, and also just how I recovered, is this understanding that there are some conditions created by the brain and then they manifest in the body rather than, the other way around. Um, but that is in no way our fault. And we don't have immediate control over that. But what I found for me was kind of learning this knowledge and then learning ways to retrain my brain and regulate my nervous system, as well as tend to my inner emotional world, which is actually driving the entire state of our perception of safety in our nervous system. Those things led me to recovery, and they also brought so many beneficial side effects. Like there were no negative side effects in the way I recovered, as opposed to the way I was trying to recover with the diet, supplements, and medications for 13 years. There were a lot of negative side effects, and for me, they didn't work. Now, if they work for someone, I think that's fantastic, utterly. If you can find a pill or a diet or something that works for you, go for it. That's wonderful. Um, but I'm just speaking from my experience and what I see with a lot of people with these conditions.
Yeah. And I think, speaking to what you just said there about, if you find a diet that helps or whatever, insert protocol here, um, that I mean, from my experience, I could, I had all these multitude of things where overnight practically I'd suddenly become unwell in so many ways that I'd never even imagined. And, for me, it was finding something that would take the edge off. For me, the breath was the thing that helped me the first, which was, why I feel so strongly about it. But, and that then allowed me to kind of see a little bit more of what was going on. And I think, that's the experience I think that quite a lot of people have. And, for me, it was the breath. For some people, it might be finding that they have an intolerance of food or something and they need to take that out. And that allows them a little bit of space. to be able to see what's going on, or whatever it is for each individual person. Maybe it's even a pharmaceutical that brings their heart rate down a little bit, something like that. So I think, it's this kind of jigsaw puzzle of things, isn't it? But what I've sort of started to understand is whatever the method of doing that, it's creating that sense of safety in our body. And how do we allow ourselves to feel safe? Um, and I that's different for everybody, isn't it? Depending on their history and their environment and their whatever.
Those were exactly the words I was just going to say, is it really is about creating a sense of safety for yourself.
Mm.
And that really is different for everybody. And I think part of the reason for me having some scientific knowledge helped is because I was already pretty scientifically oriented, and I had just seen 50 doctors who told me all these kind of sciencey, scary things. So that was an important modality essentially for me. But for some people, they may not need that. Like perhaps you could go right to the breath and notice these shifts. And I would say after that, I definitely needed and have benefited from a lot of somatic work, a real felt somatic connection with my body, because many of us who have been through trauma or even just really uncomfortable symptoms are either disconnected or completely disassociated from our body. And that is not actually a sense of felt somatic safety, right? It is a really important coping mechanism when our body feels like an unbearable place. But as we get practices that give us a little bit of relief, it's really it's really powerful to come into the body, right? Because this is where we feel emotions. This is where we feel the symptoms, or what I would call sensations in the body. And we can shift our entire state of our nervous system and our emotional state through different practices.
We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much. Yeah, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you found that were helpful. But before we do that, can you just explain a little bit about what somatic actually means?
Right, great question. Well, soma means the body. So it's essentially a connection with the body, but really I would say it's a visceral, tangible, felt connection. And so for me, somatic tracking, for instance, was a practice that was really pivotal in my recovery. And that style of meditation, we are feeling sensations in the body. So instead of just saying, I'm tired or I'm in pain, it's really noticing, oh, there's burning, oh, there's tingling or shooting or dullness or even numbness is a sensation. There's warmth or there's coolness. There's sensations that are really widespread or they're localized, and actually becoming curious about what they feel like. And when we can watch these sensations in our body with mindfulness, it actually shifts our relationship to our body. It gives us some information about what they're signaling, but it also turns down this danger response in the brain and nervous system because we're not pushing or fighting them anymore. We're just sort of noticing these sensations. So that would be an example of what I mean by somatic, is kind of feeling the sensations from the inside rather than just thinking about them in our brain.
And I think again we can find it very easy to get into the what and the why, can't we? I mean, I want to know why. I'm a logical person in a lot of ways, and I want all the answers. And and in some ways that's probably a bit of a defense mechanism because I don't want to feel, because it doesn't feel good, does it, when you have all of these awful things going on inside of you? So I think, we do become, I think, very disconnected from our bodies, because we don't want to be connected to them because they're horrible. But then that creates a problem of its own, doesn't it? Where we have no connection with ourselves, I think.
Exactly, exactly. Of course, we would disconnect from a body that is in so much pain.
Mm.
But we also then disconnect from the underlying emotions when we do that. And I found that it was really important for me to get back in touch with the emotions beneath the symptoms. Basically, the whole tender emotional part of me that had been left behind in this very long biomedical model where no one ever asked, is there anything stressful or traumatic that happened to you before you went from being this very active, young, healthy person to being homebound? And so I spent months and even years, and I would say this is still part of my daily practice, really tuning into what do different emotions feel like in my body, like anger. At first, it might start out just feeling burny and hot, but then when I would stick with it, I would actually realize it was the emotion of anger. And I had experiences where that would kind of move up and out, and sometimes it would have a memory associated with it, sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes it would completely dissipate and I would feel relief, and other times it would just stick around. But I started feeling some storehouse really of grief, of anger, of shame. I started feeling the fear, but not letting it overcome me, really in a similar way I was describing earlier, by kind of tracking these emotions in my body. And then what I started realizing is they often did have a message. They would often be saying, pay more attention to this part of me, or you need more connection, or you need more solitude, or you need to set a boundary, or whatever it is. These emotions really are vital life messengers.
Mm. And of course, you said earlier that prior to your illness, you had had a horribly traumatic experience. And I think this is quite common with a lot of people, whatever that trauma looked like for them, that they had had something that was maybe traumatic or a big stressor, maybe in the lead up to their illness.
Oh,
But
so common. Mhm.
yeah, but there's also so many people. And, I sometimes wonder, my reaction when someone said, did anything stressful happen? No. But, also I then learned over several years that actually the life I was living prior to illness was not just one, it was one big stressor in itself. Um, but there are a lot of people who say, well, I was living a very good life beforehand. I didn't have big stressors. I mean, maybe some of those traumas went back longer ago, or maybe they weren't maybe aware of them. But, does everybody have some sort of stuff in the lead up? Or, is it for some people that this really does come right out of the blue for kind of, apparently no reason?
Just love that you asked this because it is really important to express that not everyone has what we would consider capital T trauma.
Mm.
Like, I experienced a sexual assault or somebody losing their house in a fire or even going through a divorce. But I don't think I've found a single person yet, and maybe they exist, who hasn't had higher levels of stress leading up to the onset of long COVID or ME/CFS or any of these conditions that the system really kind of crashed and had a sudden um, shift in the state of well-being. And so I think sometimes it's a lot of little stressors that catch up to people. There was one woman I was working with who was saying something similarly to you, like, well, I had an okay childhood. I wasn't really stressed prior to getting COVID, but then, my whole system went haywire. But then what we really noticed as we worked together was she was feeling so disempowered and weak when she had COVID. And it actually reminded her of when she was a child. And when she would get sick, her parents were not very sympathetic with her. And she always felt like she was kind of dismissed and weak, and you had to, kind of recover very quickly and get on with things. And so it did bring up some old childhood wounds that were unresolved in her because it brought up that state of powerlessness. So I do think there are often, usually, maybe always, even though I don't like to say always, you know, psychological stress. And of course, we just know COVID itself and the pandemic was one of the most stressful global events that could happen to human beings in terms of being very isolated from each other and afraid of this unknown virus and so many other things that were happening at that time. That's plenty of emotional stress to send the brain and nervous system into a threat response. And when it's in a threat response, just getting flooded with stress hormones alone is going to make you feel really crummy. And then that can compound on itself, especially when we have a lot of fear and we don't have the right supports that help us feel safe and kind of bring us into the state that breath work probably does for you, Jackie.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. The pandemic was a major stressor, even for someone who wasn't ill at the time. And then when you catch this horrendous virus that you've been, seen all over the news, and you get it, you know, on top of it being a horrible virus, it was such a scary experience, the pandemic. And that yeah is a fairly major stressor for anybody before you even look at anything else going on prior to that, I guess. It's
And there was actually an interesting study that was done with people who ended up developing long COVID that a high percentage of them said that they had been experiencing anxiety prior to that, and perhaps even at different times in their life. So it seemed like anxiety was one predisposing factor for COVID turning into long COVID.
Mm.
And I think we didn't even realize how much stress we were under. But kind of to go back to your previous question, I do find a lot of people say that when they look back, yeah, I've actually maybe been anxious on and off my whole life, or I've had other mind body symptoms, and this could have just been the straw that broke the camel's back. And another thing we could talk about is something that you and I chatted about before a bit are some of the coping mechanisms we develop, which
Mm.
you could call personality traits, which John Sarno describes in his books as being the so-called TMS personality. But over 50 years of clinical practice with people who had chronic pain and chronic fatigue and these other medically unexplained conditions that they all had some similar personality traits. And they didn't all have these traits, but they generally all had some of them, like the people pleasing or perfectionism or putting a lot of pressure on ourselves, being self-critical, also just holding in our emotions and trying to make others happy without really acknowledging the full extent of our needs, being goodist, trying to do a lot of good in the world. And these qualities all have lots of benefits, right? I mean, there's positive aspects to them. um, but those coping mechanisms or personality traits alone can create a lot of internal stress on our nervous system. And then if we have a big external stressor, like a big virus and certainly like a pandemic, that can be enough to turn on this danger response in our physiology.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that every single one of those traits that you just named I could tick off in myself. I'm a lot better at a lot of them now, but I still notice them occasionally in myself. And that is where the gift of boundaries comes in, I think, which is something that I always laugh because I didn't even know what a boundary was. And then, through illness, you kind of have to learn them, don't you? Because you just can't. It's maybe more that the boundaries present themselves rather than that you have to put them down in some ways because the body just says no. But it's definitely been something that I find quite liberating to do occasionally, maybe more than occasionally now, where it's like, you know what? I need to stop. Sorry, guys. I don't need to explain myself. Actually, time's up, So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How we see these things as as good things. Someone described before as putting perfectionism on a CV as something that you'd get a job because you're a perfectionist. That's great. We want one of them. We want them on staff. We want them to be able to do all of the stuff, and you know um and yeah, it's interesting how I see that very differently now. That having an eye for detail, wanting to do things well, there's nothing wrong with that. But when it takes over your life and stops you from being happy and well, that is where it is obviously become much more of a problem. And I think, we were chatting, weren't we, about how we both have some of these perfectionist tendencies.
Oh yeah, and definitely still recovering perfectionist, right? I mean, I certainly wouldn't say I've mastered the perfectionism habit, but there is so much more awareness.
Mm,
And what I find is that I really enjoy striving for excellence, and I just have a very kind of meticulous mind, and
mm,
um, but I'll be enjoying it up until a certain point. And then I'll just start noticing that I'm getting tense in my body. My muscles are tensing up. I'm getting impatient. My mind's just tired from sitting at a computer so long. And so I'm much more tuned into all those body cues. That's another reason to notice what's happening in our body, because that's a message for me now. Like, I've had enough computer time. I'm done. We need to check out and just kind of let go of, all the perfect little details. And that is empowering because you're right. When you are so sick, literally you can't socialize. You might not be able to even go to the grocery store. I remember if I would just like maybe visit with friends or family for an hour, I would be so drained for a few days. I would have to kind of plan getting groceries before that visit because I wouldn't have any energy to do it after. And I do think there's something empowering about learning about your own kind of mind, body, heart, and how it best thrives, what it likes, how much extroversion, how much introversion, what you really need to thrive as a human being. And we learn these lessons in a very hard way when we're sick with these symptoms because we really can't function. But as we learn about ourselves through this healing journey, we can take these with us just in the way you do. And you say, okay, I'm done, guys, in a way you never would have before, right?
no, you would have been insulted if you'd even thought of saying something like that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's not what, nice people do.
No, no, that's definitely not. And I love what you were saying about this kind of, greater awareness in your body and, you know, the way that also that the journey is ongoing. I've said this before that recovery is kind of the start of a new journey. And I sometimes have to be a bit careful about saying that because it almost sounds like, oh, I don't want another journey. Um, but for me, the recovery journey was out of necessity. It was this horrendous experience I'd been put into that I didn't ask for, I didn't want, I didn't feel like I deserved. It was awful, and I had to kind of claw my way out, and it really wasn't a fun experience. And then you get to the end of that, and it's just like, oh my goodness, thank goodness for that. But then, for me anyway, over the next sort of few weeks, few months, even the year and a half since I've recovered now, I've been on this new journey of, okay, who am I now? Because I'm not the same person I was before. I'm far better than I was before. But I'm not the same person, and I kind of have to work out who she is or who she wants to be, which is
Yeah,
incredibly exciting, but it's also quite scary.
yeah.
It's that kind of choice, isn't it? You want to have choice, but we don't want to have too much choice. And I kind of have too much choice to start with. I think, I don't know, I see that as being a very empowering thing. It's exciting. You have this choice. You spent so long being sick where you don't have choice. And
Yes.
now you do have that choice. And I really love the way you was talking about this kind of ongoing journey and that you are a recovering perfectionist. You're not perfect at it. Irony of that.
No, right,
And I
exactly. If I'm
totally
ever
relate to that.
perfect at recovering from perfectionism, I know I've fallen back in it, right? Well,
Exactly.
and I so relate to what you're saying because it's like bringing all these unconscious assumptions and belief systems into our more conscious awareness. So we may have been raised in a way that we hold in our emotions and we just, act kind to everyone else, or we may have been raised in a way that you always just give it your all and do your best. Whatever it was, that worked for a certain period of time. And then I think what happens to so many of us on this healing journey, and I know you talk to people on your podcast like this all the time, is there becomes more awareness. It's like, what's just an old program that was given to me by my family of origin or by my culture, but that's actually not working anymore, that doesn't serve me, that doesn't really feel authentic and alive inside of my body, inside of my life. And so you realize, wow, I really get to choose. And it's not as easy as just turning a switch because our brain loves efficiency. It loves the known. It loves sameness. It doesn't love a lot of change. And so we can use, I mean, I found I've used a lot of the same tools that I retrained my brain into understanding that my body was safe. So it stopped generating symptoms I use with these personality traits like just bringing in more awareness, more mindfulness, and slowly stepping out of these patterns and realizing, wow, this actually feels much freer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the first podcast episode I put out without editing it. Oh, I mean, once I got over the absolute terror of it, it did feel incredibly liberating because I had like 3 hours that week to do fun stuff. So that felt pretty good. But yeah, it didn't feel comfortable to start with, not at all. So again, yes, work in progress for me as well. So I think maybe finally, what do you wish that you'd known 10 years ago?
Oh, I wish I had known this wasn't my fault. The
Mm.
traumas weren't my fault. How I reacted to childhood stressors weren't my fault. The fact that I got sick wasn't my fault. The fact that it took 13 years to recover, and actually even longer once I discovered kind of the path for me. None of that was my fault. And actually, I wished I had learned what I have since is that I am deserving of compassion, just like every other human being on this planet who is suffering, which is everyone, which is every one of us. And that a really helpful and life-giving response to suffering is self-compassion. And also, an antidote to perfectionism and people-pleasing is also self-compassion. And so that's become really part of the way I live now is this whole inner dialogue is very different from one of criticism and blaming myself for not recovering or for not doing things perfectly to like, oh, I'm here with you. I know you're scared. I know you're suffering and I believe in you anyway. I love you anyway. And so that would be the message. And that's what I love to convey to people on this journey is that you deserve that warm, safe listening ear, and you can give yourself that. And you are not to blame for any of this. You really just need to be loved. And I feel that so much of what ails us, certainly a lot of the inner emotional struggles that we go through on the recovery journey, really are parts of us asking for acceptance, acknowledgement, and love.
Yeah.
It is a medicine. That is a medicine. And I'm not saying that that is the only answer, but I found that it also led me to any other answers I needed when I was beginning to treat myself with kindness and even with a form of reverence.
Mm. And that all of those things are things that we can give ourselves.
We can all give it to ourselves. And the truth is we're really the only one that can, because I've
Mm.
never found another person that could say the exact same words that I want to hear in the moment I want to hear them, in the way I want to hear them, except myself. And so of course
Mm.
we need other people and we need connection. And this is not a replacement of that. But we are living inside our minds and our bodies 24/7. And it's just this built-in internal medicine we have to cultivate self-compassion.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful place to leave it. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming along and chatting and sharing your story and so much wisdom. And hopefully, it's helpful for some people who are listening.
I so appreciate you having me. I love your podcast and just all the heart you bring to this space. So thank you, Jackie.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self produced and self funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch